Further debate on this? Senator Crapo.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. I just want to respond to a couple of the comments that have been made. First of all, as my colleague Senator Gregg has indicated, we understand your reluctance to deal with Fannie and Freddie in a final way in this legislation. I personally believe that we could go a lot further in terms of how we deal with Fannie and Freddie in this legislation, but that is not the issue that this amendment brings. This amendment simply brings basically a three-pronged effort to try to set the stage for how we will deal with Fannie and Freddie as we wait for the day when we can actually reform Fannie and Freddie as we should. What does it do? First, as the CBO has said we should do, since they are effectively government agencies now, we should bring them on budget. That's only being transparent with the American taxpayer. And as Senator Gregg has indicated, we do, by the way, need a budget in this Congress. But in whatever way that we approach budgeting in this Congress, we ought to be transparent enough to include the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac transactions in our budget. The second thing that it does is that it reverses the Christmas taxpayer massacre that took place just before Christmas Eve massacre last year. And why the reason I call it a massacre is because the existing $200 billion per entity loss caps were lifted by the Secretary of Treasury so that the loss limitation to the U.S. taxpayer today is infinity. We've told the American public that we are going to back this as far as it goes, even though the previous law said that there was a $200 billion per entity cap loss, or loss cap. And again, as Senator Gregg has said, that still gives us a $250 billion buffer from where we are today and is still more than the projected losses, which, as I've said, I think may be too optimistic, but is still more than the projected losses. The last thing it does is, in I think a very responsible fashion, is that it says to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that they need to start reducing the size of their portfolios by 10%. They need to start, again, aiming at that target, which also seems to have been forgotten. So this is a very reasonable amendment. It does not seek to force this Congress to resolve Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in its finality. It simply says, let's be transparent in the budget, because these are debts of the U.S. taxpayer now. Let's put the loss caps back in place so that the potential loss to the taxpayer is not infinity. And let's start the process of downsizing the risk that these two entities represent to the U.S. taxpayer. The last thing I'll say, Mr. Chairman, is if you take the bailouts of Fannie and Freddie and compare them to every other bailout, the auto industry, AIG, the other financial bailouts, Fannie and Freddie alone are equal to the rest of them and more. This is a huge part of the problem. We ought to at least begin the process of transparency, returning the caps that we had before, and start to downsize the issue.
I thank my colleague for any further debate on this issue. If not, all those in favor of the Crapo amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
No. Noes appear to have it. Roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no. Mr. Johnson?
No.
Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Reed?
No.
Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Schumer?
No by proxy.
Mr. Schumer, no by proxy. Ms. Lincoln?
No.
Ms. Lincoln, no. Mr. Leahy?
No by proxy.
Mr. Leahy, no by proxy. Mr. Harkin?
No by proxy.
Mr. Harkin, no by proxy. Mr. Shelby?
Aye.
Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Crapo?
Aye.
Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Corker?
Aye.
Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Gregg?
Aye.
Mr. Gregg, aye. Mr. Chambliss?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Chambliss, aye by proxy. The vote are 7 aye, excuse me. The vote is 5 aye, 7 no. The measure fails.